There's something missing in our equations. There's something missing in the way we think. It's not just a question of that we need better theory. We need better ways of thinking. And that's what Einstein meant when he made his very famous statement around the world, maybe one of his most quoted, that you can't solve problems through the same way of thinking by which you created them.
First, could you maybe tell us a bit about your personal story and what got you interested in the history of the mind and civilization in the first place?
Okay. Well, I'll try to give you a shorter version. I'm American from California. I went to UC Berkeley in the 60s, which was at the beginning of the hippie movement and of the student protests that broke out actually on the month that I landed at UC Berkeley. And going through that experience for 4 years really made me question and think about a lot of things. I studied psychology because I wanted to learn about myself, and I was quite disappointed. I learned a lot about cats and monkeys and mice and mazes, but I was really disappointed with what I got. And on the advice of an influential relative, I got into a top medical school to become a psychiatrist, which I wasn't really interested in the medicine part, but I thought maybe I could learn something more about psychology at a higher level. And then realized that's not what I want to do. And I dropped out of medical school after a month and spent 2 years in Berkeley just reading on my own things that I had never touched before, which were there in the atmosphere, but had never been in my education or exposure. I had never read the Bible before, for example, but the I Ching, things about Indian philosophy, the Tao Te Ching, so many different things. And I found it all fascinating. But I couldn't say that I really got an answer for what I was looking for. I read the collected works of Carl Jung, which was about 15 volumes at that time. And I was fascinated by it. And I thought, at least he is a man who's got a quest and so forth. But after 2 years, I wasn't really very clear that I knew more about what I wanted to do than before. And so finally, I was under a lot of pressure from parents after spending 2 years pretty much on my own. And so I decided to go back to medical school if I could and follow my original plan and then maybe go to the Jungian Institute and learn something interesting. And a few months before the beginning of the semester, I went into a bookstore in Berkeley, and we were leaving to go to Hawaii, and a book from the top shelf fell right on my lap while I was looking at some books on the bottom shelf. And it was a book by a Frenchman called Sri Aurobindo, or The Adventure of Consciousness. It was a book about Indian philosophy and yoga. And I had heard the name Sri Aurobindo and seen his very serious works. And I had decided quite some time ago that that's not what's interesting to me. I'm interested in life. I'm interested in the real world and my place in it. And India seemed to be a little too much. But anyway, I couldn't figure out how the book fell on my lap. So just out of a quirk, I bought it and took it home and told my fiance that this is what happened. And 10 days later, we got married and we went on a hippie wedding and honeymoon in the mountains of San Bernardino. And we did a lot of reading. She took this book with her and she said, I think you want to read this book. And I said, really? No, she says, I really think you want to read this book. And then we went for a month on our honeymoon to, this was this late 60s, to a Poland Springs, Maine, an old resort where Maharishi Mahesh Yogi was training TM meditators on how to be trainers for other people. And we had done TM for a year. I had done it, enjoyed it, but never really felt that it was the answer to my life. And I took this book along with me, and while we were listening to the Maharishi Downs, I wanted to see somebody who's supposed to be a spiritual person. And while we were listening to him in the mornings, in the afternoons, I'd go up to my room and read this book. And I just really was fascinated by it. That's the base. A year later, I quit medical school for the second time. And we went off to India and to Pondicherry, which is where I am now, and joined the Sri Aurobindo ashram. And I just found my things I never thought I would do. I thought, this is not me. First of all, I love California. It's nice and clean and all. And we just fell in love with it. And so I've spent a few years in the ashram and met a really remarkable man and started studying. I studied all of their work, Sri Aurobindo and the mother, Pondicherry. Oroville was just getting started at that time. But then looking at a wide range of other things from what I'd call a spiritual perspective. And we started doing studies for the government of India on how to accelerate Indian development, how to change the educational system. I worked on an original theory of business management, and 10 years later, I ended up publishing a book in the US on it and became a lecturer and consultant on business management. But all the ideas really came out of my exposure in India, though I did a pretty good job of concealing it because the business was not really looking for Indian inspiration at that time, if they are now. And after that, we took up work on international development just before the end of the Cold War. I helped found an international commission on peace and food, top-level people. We studied problems of the world internationally. And then I was elected. We did a report for the UN, and I was elected as a fellow of the World Academy of Art and Science, which now, 25, almost 30 years later, I'm the president of the Academy. Again, something I never thought of, something I'm really out of place for me because I'm not a traditional academic, but I am really interested in knowledge and ideas and how they influence the world, and has spent the last 30 years studying, trying to understand how consciousness impacts on the world and our thinking and our education and so forth. And that's what I'm doing today. Just a couple of sentences on that. The World Academy was founded I saw something on your website about Robert Oppenheimer. Oppenheimer was one of the founders of the World Academy, along with Einstein and Bertrand Russell and others. And their focus was on the social responsibility of science, as you can well understand, after the consequences of the Manhattan Project and nuclear weapons. And I'm running programs on everything from economy and education and climate and all of the challenges that they're facing today. War, disarmament, nuclear weapons are still on. We look at a cross-range section of the problems and challenges that humanity faces and look for solutions. So that's a background of what I do.
Si tu apprécies cette chaîne, pense à t'abonner et à activer la cloche. Et n'hésite pas à donner de la visibilité à cette vidéo en la likant, en la partageant ou en la commentant. La Fabrique Sociale est un média indépendant et a grand besoin de soutien financier. Si tu en as les moyens, n'hésite pas à faire un don sur ma page Tipeee. Même les petits gestes sont très importants pour la survie de cette chaîne. Le lien est disponible dans les notes.
Scientist Gregory Bateson famously said the major problems in the world are the result of the difference between how nature works and the way people think. Do you agree with this statement?
By the way, Nora is a member, his daughter is a member of the Academy. I think that the problems that we face in the world are certainly a result of the way people think, definitely. And certainly it's different from the way nature works, if we mean by that physical nature as we know it, if that's what he had in mind, the way he thinks that science has documented. I'm not quite sure what he meant by nature at that time, but if you assume it's the natural world, certainly we don't in some respects, but I'm not sure we should be thinking the way nature does. I mean, survival of the fittest, if that's what he meant, is probably not a great formula for human progress. But I think, so I agree with the premise that the problems we have are directly the result of the way we think. And I think there's a lot we can learn from nature that would help us in that. So to that extent, I'd say I agree with this statement.
In his article, The Kekulé Problem, the novelist Cormac McCarthy claims that in order to solve problems, we use language way less than we think. He takes the example of the German chemist Kekulé, who found the formula of the benzene molecule in his dreams by seeing the particular shape of a snake. In your opinion, what is language, and is language a necessary tool for thinking?
Well, I think that language is the use of symbols to represent reality. We create sounds, which in most cases don't have any great significance on their own, and we use them to represent our experiences or things that we exist, that things we experience or think exist. And we use it to communicate about those things and about ourselves and our relationship to the world. And that is a particular type of thinking, or depending on how you define thinking, language is central to the way we think. And it's, I think when we use the word thinking, we mean using language and symbols to comprehend and communicate our understanding of reality. But that doesn't mean that language is the only, or thinking is the only way that we can do that. And I think the example you've given about his discovery of the shape of benzene, I think it was, right? Is an example of a higher way of knowing, which we'd call intuition. And intuition, my understanding of intuition is that it is not a function of the thinking mind. It's a function of a higher way of knowing, which represents a truth, a reality to the mind and then is translated by the mind through thought, through language, into something that can be communicated to other people. But as he saw a vision or an image, and he drew a knowledge from that, drew a conclusion from that, and he used thinking and language in order to communicate it to other people. But I don't think that the phenomenon itself was not done through language. It was done through an image. And the knowledge that he got to recognize that this image in a dream was really solving a problem for him in life, I'd say that was not a thinking process. That was an intuitive process, a higher way of knowing.
In your paper, you explain the following. In the pursuit of knowledge, our minds divide reality into parts. Could you expand on that a little bit?
I'm talking now, mind is a big word, and my understanding, there are many different levels of mind. But when we use the word mind, we normally mean the thinking mind, the symbolic mind, or the rational mind for that. And I think the way mind works, there are a few characteristics of mind. It doesn't know things directly. It deals with symbols. It's an indirect way of knowing. And whereas an intuition, you know who you are, and I know who I am. I don't need to think about it. I don't need to have words for it. I know that I exist. That's a direct way of knowing. We use mind and language to indirectly know things through symbols. And those symbols are not the reality, they're a representation of the reality. And we know things by separating from them. We think of ourselves as separate from it. Whereas if I ask you, do you exist? You don't have to look at yourself or consult yourself. You experience it directly and you know it directly. So the way our minds think is separative. The other characteristic, which is the one you're referring to, is that our mind, the normal thinking mind, I would say, to be more precise, the analytic mind, its way of thinking is to divide reality and focus on one thing at a time, and to try to make sense of it, and to separate out its component parts, and to analyze it, and to see it smaller and smaller parts, and to collect as much as we can about all of those parts, and zero down into what the reality of the thing is. Is it an animal? Is it a plant? Is it a human being? Is it a material substance, or whatever it else is? And that type of thinking, which I call analytic, is what led us to discover however many minerals there are, atoms there are, types of atoms there are, how many molecules there are, different species, life species, botanical species, zoological species, and so forth and so on. We analyze the world, break it up into smaller and smaller pieces until we try to become an expert on how those things work. And the result of that is we have now, I recently looked, more than 2,000 different disciplines of knowledge. We started with about 5, history and literature and so forth. They're about because we keep dividing this reality into smaller and smaller pieces, and the more we look and concentrate on them, the more we zero down into their apparently separate reality, which what distinguishes them from something else. Mind knows things by comparing, by contrast and comparison and categorization. And that's what I mean by that statement about the way mind knows. But that doesn't mean it's the only way the mind can know. And I think we're gradually learning other ways.
You are a deep student of Eastern thinking. In your opinion, how does this way of thinking differentiates itself from Western thought?
Well, I won't try to comment on Western thought in general. I think what you meant by that, you could correct me, but I think what you meant by that is the prevailing way of thinking in the world today, scientifically, whether we call that Western or not, is pretty much the thinking in the world. At one time, it wasn't that prevalent in the West, and it wasn't prevalent in other countries. So I think that there is something not only in Eastern traditions, but even in our own ancient or the ancient Western, before the Enlightenment, before the scientific revolution and everything. If you go back far enough, there are characteristic ways of knowing that were different. And we tend to recognize that more in the thought of the East, and I think that's what you're trying to say. We also have a much older record of that ancient knowledge in the East than we do in the West, because before 2,000 years ago, we have very little. Before Greece, before Athens, we don't have much of what the real thinking in the West was. It goes back further in other places. But I think that the idea that this is the way of knowing, that is, let's call it science, that science is the way of knowing reality, did develop and gain its prominence in the West, and it is a dominant paradigm all over the world today. And it has resulted in phenomenal accomplishments and discoveries all over the world, but it's not a complete knowledge, and it doesn't give us all the knowledge. And the limitations in science now become some of the most serious obstacles to knowledge, because we've applied it so fully and taken it as the reality. And we see that with all our science and with all our accomplishments, with all our technological development, in some sense, we have more uncertainty today, and we certainly have more serious problems today. Or let's say we have, with all the progress we've made, with all the prosperity, with all the spread of education. So I think that regardless of, I prefer to think of it as the analytic way of thinking, and how it has evolved beyond analysis, are expressions of the limitations of mind. They are expressions of the power of mind, which are remarkable. And the achievements we have are largely due to that. But the problems we have are also the result of that. And now science and humanity is trying to search and find out, how do we stop making these mistakes, and how do we rectify the limitations in an analytic thinking? And that's been happening in the last century or so, first with the birth of systems thinking, where we try to, what you rightly referred to as an Eastern way of thinking has been much more holistic. Instead of dividing and seeing everything separate, it has been much more conscious of the totality and the relationships. And now science, building on its analysis, is trying to connect all the pieces that it has and how they're related to each other. It's trying to construct a model of reality that doesn't have the limitations. And now we go from systems theory to complexity theory. And we still see, and it has been the source of many great achievements and discoveries over time, but it has not yet helped us fully solve the problems we have because it's still not a whole knowledge. And what we're trying to do in the academy, and others I think are too, is to see, can we really get an integrated knowledge that understands the complete relationship between things that the mind tends to regard as separate? So I'm using the word integral for that. And this is one of the aspects of science that we're trying to put all the pieces together. And you can't just jam them together and draw lines together. We try to see the greater whole from which they're apart. And incidentally, for that, I think that the problems with the environment have been one of the very powerful stimulus for us to change the way we think. And even to go back to what Bateson was talking about, the way things are done in nature. Because the more you study nature, and there have been tremendous discoveries in the last 50 years, the more we discover it's not a bundle of things. It's not even a mechanical system. You can't reduce it just to mechanism. It's not just physics. Everything is part of a larger integrated reality. Every species has a role in that reality. And just for one example, most of us don't realize that the coral reefs, which are the place in the ocean where the phytoplankton, microscopic phytoplankton, grows, is the source of somewhere between 50 and 80% of the oxygen on the planet. And when you study and see what global warming, when we're burning fossil fuels, for among other things, is doing, it's killing the coral reef, it's killing the phytoplankton. And this is not a lot of separate things. This is a system. This is a reality. And I did study in medical school for a year. And, one of the things we study in physiology and anatomy is that the human body consists of many different systems. We've got a circulatory system, a respiratory system, a nervous system, a muscular, a skeletal, a hormonal, and so forth, But when you really study the reality of it, there are no separate systems. None of them, we abstract it so that somebody can concentrate on being a cardiologist and somebody can be a neurologist, but that doesn't exist. Without the cardiovascular and the pulmonary system and everything, you don't have nerves, you don't have heart, all of these things are part of an integral whole. And the characteristic of our thinking, which we call the scientific method, has been one that divides and separates. Whereas the Oriental thinking, and you can say from spiritual experiences, the type of knowledge that's come has tended to be much more holistic, much more seeing the relationship and the interconnectivity. And that's what's happening in ecology too, because the environmental problems are really a great education to humanity to stop thinking of reality as a bunch of independent things that somehow we've mixed together and understand them as an integral whole. And the same thing is true not only in nature, the same thing is true in society. I mentioned my work on business and my writing, and I've done consulting. That the traditional way of teaching business is you start with a company as a separate thing, or an entrepreneur that wants to start a company as a separate thing. And you study all of the things he needs for that. He needs a product, he needs a market, he needs some money and technology and so forth. He needs some people and all, and fits it all together and studies. And this is still how business is taught to a very large extent, studies how that company relates and can succeed. But the reality is, no company exists on its own. Everything a company has comes from the society, including comes from the environment. The people, the knowledge, the technology, the markets, everything. But we teach it as if I'm a separate thing, and how do I thrive in the world, taking advantage of other things and competing with other things, rather than realizing society is the whole. Society, including the environment behind it. And it is that gives all the resources. And the success of a business depends on its capacity to attune to what that society needs, to attune to those resources of all types. And by that synergy with them, to grow as it grows. And so I'm just giving this as an example. Maybe one more obvious example is, for 200 years, I believe you're an economist or you studied economics.
Yeah.
You know, for the first 200 years, you won't find the word environment in economic theory. Or let's say it would be very rare. Because economics, the typical way in which the analytic mind thinks, we think of economics as one thing separate from everything else, including separate from the environment, which is pretty humorous when you see what we know now. And we study it separately. But to really understand economy, to really understand the way it functions, and especially how to solve our problems, we have to understand the relationship to law and governance and political science. You can't have what we call a free market without a legal system. The only thing that keeps it free is the law and governance. Otherwise, you have a free-for-all of robbery. You can't have it without the psychology of people and the motivations and aspirations and doubts and fears and trusts and values and so forth. So there's a lot of artificiality in especially when we go from the physical world, from the natural world, we go to the human world, the social world. Unfortunately, or maybe inevitably, the social sciences have grown up after the physical sciences, taken the physical sciences as the ideal, because you can measure everything and define it. And you can do that fairly well when you're dealing with matter and atoms and molecules. But when you come to the world of human beings, conscious human beings, and whether you're studying psychology or government or cultures or anything like that, you find out that the assumption that everything is material, that everything can be measured and quantified, that everything's objective, because science was born to study the objective world outside us, and assumed that was the sole reality. And we know very well in social science, we should know anyway, and that was one of my complaints with psychology, that we were studying human beings more like physical things, and neuroscience is doing that today and trying to explain all our inner experience as if it's a material thing, and neglecting the subjective dimensions of our experience, which ends in consciousness. And at least psychology is willing to say, I think even Dennett is willing to say, we don't know what consciousness is, even though it's the foundation for our existence. So I think this is an example of a fundamental, let's say, I'm not saying that the path of our progress wasn't been natural. We studied with the outer world. We studied with the things we could see. We've gained a tremendous amount of knowledge about it. But when we applied the same approach to understanding ourselves and society and people and governance and happiness and so forth, we found out that the same methodology, we can create a lot of statistics in economics and all, but there's something missing, a number of things missing. One of them is the fact that we're trying to treat the whole reality as objective, and whereas our whole reality is primarily, or at least is subjective. It depends on our perception. It depends on our aspirations, our fears, our values. And one other thing, I'll just end this with that. I think one of the things I discovered, which really fascinated me, was that the thing we have ignored and virtually ignored in the social sciences is the individual. Our science tells us very little about the individual. We can categorize people and say how we're different from each other in height and weight or religion or beliefs or personality or something. We categorize people. But the individual is the human individual is the most remarkable thing in the universe, at least that we've run into so far. And the scientific method doesn't help us very much in understanding individual uniqueness, in understanding, not just categorizing us, but all the great achievements of humanity, and you mentioned some examples in your questions, were done by individuals who thought differently, who acted differently, who created differently, whether they're explorers or adventurers or warriors or leaders or thinkers or philosophers or scientists or poets or artists. Society grows through that. How is it that with all our study and our knowledge, we understand so little about this phenomenon of individuality? Because analytic thinking only compares things. It doesn't get down to their essence. So,
is there a way to explain how this analytic way of thinking got so widespread in our world? How did it become the dominant view?
Well, I think it's, by the way, before we had the analytic thinking, we had different types of thinking. Analysis has always been there, but it hasn't been the dominant paradigm until this. But remember, the scientific revolution really started as a reaction against religious thought in the West, when Christianity was dominating Europe, and it was telling people what to think and explaining the reality to them. And that was the kind of, whether you call that symbolic thinking or religious, whatever words you want to use, it wasn't based on an analysis of fact. And when a perception came in the society at that time, after the Renaissance, in the beginning of the Enlightenment, to question that maybe everything in the Bible isn't true, at least of facts. In the beginning, Newton, while he was studying the laws of thermodynamics and motion, he was also trying to calculate the longevity of the Earth from the Bible. He was studying the Bible to try to figure out how old the Earth is, and I think his figures were somewhere between 5,000 and 6,000 years old, whereas analytic science says it's closer to 13. The universe is 13 billion, and Earth somewhere shortly after that. So I think there have been other dominant paradigms which serve their own purpose, but when the analytic thinking that we call science happened, it persisted, and because it was so powerful, practically powerful, in explaining things that we didn't know before. It helps, it was applied for technology, and it helped develop the sextant and the chronometer and the things that enabled Western society to travel around the world, and gunpowder and so forth, and so many things. And it did give us a knowledge of the world, of the natural world, which that anybody could understand, and more than that, anybody could validate it for themselves. You know, the thing about science, the scientific method was a method where don't take my word for it. You don't have to believe what I say. It should be something you can replicate so that we have a way of agreeing on what's true, not because I believe it and you believe it, but because I can demonstrate it and you can test it and we can experiment and come to something common. So it was looking for a measure of a way of knowing which we could all agree on, regardless of what our religions were, for example, in one thing. And in the process of that, it made great discoveries, phenomenal discoveries. But if you look at it, if we don't overstate, we're only talking about a 500-year period. And civilization goes back, well, we don't know much before 5,000 years ago, but it's a phase. And I don't think that there's any reason to believe, any rational reason to believe, that this will continue to be the dominant paradigm in future. In fact, it's already seeking, it's already conscious of its limitations, it's already seeking to evolve, and it has been changing. And the things that I talked about are happening through science and by scientists as well as by others. And I think that it'll keep evolving and searching. What started as the quest in ancient Greece, and even before that in ancient India and everything, it's evolving. I just want to, you know, I don't think it's the end of anything. And what we face today in the world, we are at a point where the challenges facing humanity are very great. Never before in the world have human beings been so interconnected in one society, in the sense that we all know each other, we're all interacting with each other. Never before have we extended our lifespan like we have now. Never before have we had the capacity for production as we have now. But never before has humanity had such an impact on destroying the very nature and environment in which we live that undermines our very future of existence, and apart from our environment, of creating weapons that can destroy us as well as the environment. So I think that, and that's really one of the reasons that the World Academy was started, because they realized there's some problem with our thinking. There's some problem with our using just science by it is. And, you know, the Academy was, as I said, started in 1960. In 1957 or 58, I think it was published in 58, was a book called Science and Human Values by a Polish mathematician, Bronowski. And I think it's very interesting because before the atomic bomb came, science was kind of living in an ivory tower. Nobody took science as the ultimate power in the world, or it was, okay, it's interesting, they're doing things, sometimes it comes up with something helpful for us and useful, and we apply a technology for it. But science itself realized after the atomic bomb and then the hydrogen bomb that the power of knowledge is the greatest power in the world, and it can be used, as it has been, to save millions or billions of lives and extend the lifespan, but it can also be used for self-destruction. It's a double-edged sword. And so science began to ask the question, it's not just the pursuit of knowledge. The pursuit of knowledge can build nuclear weapons. It can build AI, and AI is a remarkable invention, but that AI could, there's enough fear about how it can destroy the world and destroy jobs and even humanity. So science realized it's missing something. Science prided itself on the fact that it's objective and it doesn't deal with value judgments. It's because if we want to measure and what's the speed of light or what's the atomic weight of a substance, it doesn't become our opinion. It has to be something we can validate. But human life is filled with values, and we have to decide what's the things we should be doing and the things we shouldn't be doing. And it's not that all knowledge is good. The knowledge depends on what we're going to do with it, the values that we're going to use in doing it. So I think this is only, I'm talking only about 60 years ago, 65 years ago, that we really began the scientific revolution that began 500 years ago. In the last half a century has really begun to say we cannot separate knowledge from values. We cannot separate the objective reality from our subjective reality of what we sense or understand or believe deeply is really important. Science cannot tell us that. It can tell us about many things, but it can't tell us that. So I think science is evolving and it's moving. And I think it has a long way to go because we still see today that for every one of our positive accomplishments, we're generating more problems for ourselves. We thought we solved the ozone problem, but now we've got the O2 problem and the methane problem, which is much worse than that, which means we don't fully understand what we're doing. And so I think, to me, the most important question that science and humanity should be asking now is, how do we get a more reliable form of knowledge? What's missing in our analytic and even in our materialistic, in our objectivity, however invaluable they are in their own right, but what's missing? And in the academy, we refer to it as what kind of knowledge would really be reliable, that won't be a double-edged sword, that has one positive thing and lots of side effects that we never anticipated before. And we think that's the direction. That's what humanity should be asking itself, and that's what science should be doing. And I think many scientists are, and it's changing. But we have a long way to go. And when I say science, of course, I don't just mean the natural sciences or the biological sciences. I mean the political science. You see what's happening today when we can bear it. What happened to all our knowledge about governance and about democracy and about representative government and everything? And what's wrong with, what's limited about our understanding that we drew a constitution. As an American, we've got a constitution which the Supreme Court is using to say that anybody can have an Uzi or something much worse than that. I mean, there's something more than the political processes that we have, the economic processes we have. We now see that more and more production is not necessarily good. We now see more and more medical, according to the WHO, the single greatest threat to human health today is the environment. And the environmental threat is entirely due to what we're doing with our technology and our economic activity. Where is that in our economics? Where is that in our economic theory that tells us that what we produce cannot be just what's profitable, cannot be just what's efficient, but it has to be that which is sustainable and doesn't destroy the environment or our health or anything else in the process. So it's a process. About 15 years ago in the academy, we framed a project which we called Limits to Rationality. And this was at the beginning of this trying to understand. Rationality is considered our highest, by many people anyway, our highest thing that makes us human. That we have the capacity for rational thinking, and it's certainly the basis of science. So we came up with this phrase, I don't remember who did it, limits to rationality. And it's an ambiguous phrase because in one sense it means, and every psychologist knows this, I think, that human beings are not very rational. In fact, rationality is more of an exception. We have emotions, we have egoistic urges, we have preferences, we have desires, and I want it whether I should have it or not, and I'll eat it whether it's good for me or not, and good for my health or not. And so limits to rationality in the sense that we are not really that rational. That's one side of the equation, and we're trying and hope to become more. At the same time, rationality itself has its limits. And that's kind of what I've been talking about. You can apply the rationality of economics and say we're doing the thing that's going to create the best for everybody, and it doesn't. And that's true of rationality. There's something missing in our equations. There's something missing in the way we think. So it's not just a question of that we need better theory, we need better ways of thinking. And that's what Einstein meant when he made his very famous statement, oft quoted around the world, maybe one of his most quoted, that you can't solve problems through the same way of thinking by which you created them. And that's really what I take your questions in that sense. And that's really, to me, one of the most important things that we should be doing in trying to advance our knowledge and advance our educational system. And how should we do it differently? We have to learn from all our experience. We've got a lot of scientific evidence, quantitative evidence to show something's wrong. And we better find a better way to do it.
Einstein also said, I quote, the intuitive mind is a sacred gift and the rational mind is a faithful servant. And we have created a society that honors the servant and has forgotten the gift.
In my research, I came across a very famous Indian mathematician, maybe one of the most famous mathematicians of the 20th century. Maybe it should be even earlier. But Ramanujam, Srinivas Ramanujam. And Ramanujam was uneducated, grew up in a poor family in South India, taught himself mathematics. Maybe he went and had some. He didn't have a bachelor's degree. And he wrote down hundreds and hundreds of theorems. And he showed them to people and nobody could make anything of it and thought it's ridiculous, and finally met a professor at Madras University who said, I'm not capable of judging this. He sent it to Professor Hardy at Cambridge in England. And Hardy, he sent him a notebook with about 100 of these formulas he had written. And Hardy was so impressed that he paid for Ramanujam to come to England and asked him, how did you arrive at these? You haven't given us any proofs. You've simply written the formulas. How did you arrive at them? And Ramanujam said, I saw them. I saw them in my meditation. And that was enough to make everybody skeptical. And in some cases, he said, now look, it's very interesting because you have written a theorem that's very close to what was recently discovered. Where did you get it? He said, I don't know. I haven't read anybody else's discovery. And what about the others? And somebody else said, this is really remarkable that anybody could do this. There must be 100 of them. And he said, oh, it's not 100. I have 10 more notebooks. And Hardy spent the rest of his life and career proving that many, and most of them, I don't know the exact figure, but many of them have been since proven by other mathematicians that they were correct. But the most interesting, and there was a movie made of him just a few years ago, The Man Who Knew Infinity, I think it was called. It was very well done. And the story is very good. But the most interesting thing for me was not that. After these things were proved, the mathematicians at Cambridge were unwilling to acknowledge that Ramanujan had done something exceptional. And Hardy was quite disappointed by this, because he had seen this man as a genius. And finally, by Hardy's initiative, Ramanujan was awarded he was admitted as a fellow of the Royal Society, which was the #1 scientific institute in the whole world. And still, the mathematicians at Cambridge said he doesn't have an education. They finally gave him a BA. He was doing things that no PhD could do. And my point was, as far as we have records, the thing that was most interesting, not one person, at least I've not found any record of it, that anyone said, Ramanujan, can you please tell me how to do this? This is Einstein's point. Even after, we have whole history of science, and Einstein has said it, and Karl Popper, the famous philosopher of science, has documented this, though he's anything but a mystic. He's very down to earth. But he says the greatest scientific discoveries were made by intuition, not by logical, rational mental processes. And what Einstein is saying is, nobody asked, how can I get the intuition? What we teach, we don't teach intuition. We don't even do research on it. We teach the scientific method. We teach the experimental method. We teach the data even after evidence like this. And that's what Einstein means. He says, even though his acknowledgement is that his greatest discoveries were not arrived at rationally, but nobody wants to know the alternative, we still give all the credit to the rational mind. We feel comfortable there. It's safe territory because we all think we can do it. So so that's what I mean when science is evolving. When science has to evolve further, we have to concede that there are higher ways of knowing, that there are higher forms of consciousness, and we have to go out and actually try to acquire them. And science itself, in its conservatism, is hesitant. I'm safe now. I'm a scientist. I have the status. I've got a PhD. All my articles are published because I use the scientific method, but I don't know if I can get an intuition. And I'll believe it when I see it. And I think that's where we are now. And now that AI has come, it's very interesting. Because I've met with a number of leading neuroscientists who are working in the field of artificial intelligence and all. And one of them, who's quite distinguished in Europe, he says, the real answer to this is consciousness. He's part of a group of dozens of neuroscientists from all over Europe, from top universities and research institutes and everything. And the only problem is neuroscience is unwilling to deal with the question of what is consciousness. And without pursuing that, if we're trying to reduce consciousness to neurons and neuroprocesses, which is the analytic, that is the scientific method, we'll cut it up into small pieces and finally find out the physical basis for it. We're not going to reach it. That's my understanding. And science is at that transition. So this is a time when there could be a breakthrough. And I think there are, and by the way, this neuroscientist says he's not permitted to talk about the word consciousness to neuroscientists, even though he's convinced that the real solution is there. It's not admitted. We have something like the intolerance of religion to something that questions the prevailing doctrine. So science is on a borderline, and it's very, that's why I feel this topic is so important. We have to understand how we have evolved, how our thinking has evolved, which is what the paper was trying to trace, and what are the future directions for it that we have to pursue, because it's so important to our future destiny.
And what should the education of the 21st century look like in order to transcend our current paradigm?
What a wonderful question, Victor. I thank you for that. I wish everybody would be asking that question and coming up with their own answer. I think that this is a project that we've taken up in the Academy and done a lot of thinking about. And I think obviously from what I've said, we should understand the limits of the way of our knowing. We're not trying to discredit ourselves or anybody else. Only when we understand the limits to our current way of thinking will we be able to transcend them. I've coined a phrase, I don't know if it'll help, but mind is like a rear view mirror. When we look back to what's happened in the past, it's like we see the clear pathway from the past to the present. But when we turn around and try to look forward, we're pretty blind. This was most dramatically illustrated to me when in 1989, I was sent to Moscow. This was before the fall of the Berlin Wall. We were trying to do something to promote a thaw in the Cold War and some kind of a breakthrough. And I met lots of people all over the world at that time, from very senior people. And I never met anybody who said, you know, in a year or two, the Berlin Wall can fall, the Cold War can end, the Communist Party can be dissolved, the Soviet Union can be dissolved, the Eastern Bloc can be dissolved. In a couple of years, Europe will form the European Union, and it'll grow from 8 or 12 countries to 28 or 30. And nuclear arms race will be over, and everything. I never met, these were all experts. I never met anybody who spoke about any of these things. And interestingly enough, one of my colleagues in the Academy was a close advisor to Mikhail Gorbachev while he was still president of the Soviet Union. And he says, about a month before I came to Moscow for the first time, Gorbachev and Chancellor Kohl of Germany were meeting, talking personally. He was there, my colleague was there. And they said, you know, let's admit it, that sometime Germany should be reunited. You know, what happened in 45, we have to undo that. Eventually, Germany has a right to be reunited. But the most interesting thing of it was, they both accepted, well, yes, that should happen sometime, maybe in 30 years or 50 years. Within 12 months, Germany was reunited. I'm saying this to say, we can learn from our mistakes. We can learn from our limitations and our blindness rather than trying to defend it. And I think that's what we need today. We don't have today, the leaders don't have today a solution to all our problems. And the ones they're trying are not working. We spend so much money on national defense or on, for peace, and we're getting war that could break out and be worse than any war we've had up until now. So we need to be self-critical, and science needs to be, and we need to learn. It's not to condemn anybody. We need to understand the limitations in the way we're thinking and learn how to know more and know better, and with a lot more tolerance for other ways of knowing than we presently have. Because, and that's always true, but I think science is pretty much self-satisfied with itself in spite of the problems. So this is an important time. I'm very optimistic, and a lot of my colleagues are, that this is an opportunity for us. I think we really need to reunite ourselves with the world, with nature, the objective and the subjective. Our values, our feelings, our aspirations are really important as the facts and the data. And incidentally, because of AI has come in the picture, I think AI can help us. There's a lot of debate about AI taking over and making us superfluous. I don't believe that that's a possibility, because I don't believe that AI is conscious. And most scientists will admit that they have, AI can imitate what we think of as conscious behavior, but we have no evidence that it's conscious. But that doesn't mean it can't help us. And one of the ways AI can help us, and I'd say is beginning to help us, is AI has not been trained to think in silos and be just an expert in economics or political science or physiology or anatomy or anything else. When you ask it a question, like in the ChatGPT or Gemini or something like that, it can pull out, it can see relationships from all different disciplines, from all fields of knowledge that you'll never get when you approach it through a specialization. So I think it can help us think in a more integral way, in a more relational way than we have been thinking up until now. It's what we've created. And I think it can help us break some of the barriers, and it is doing that, and it will do it more. I think it's not a question of AI, taking over and replacing us. It's a question of what we're going to do with it. What are the values and intentions? If we want to use it, I think AI could help us create today the greatest educational system that the world doesn't have. We have, 20 years ago, we had about 100 million people in higher education, youth. Today, we have 200 million. But if we really want to give opportunity for higher education to everybody in the world, we would need to double what we have today. And that would cost tens of trillions of dollars, which is not available. But we're working on a way in which we can create a global system of education that could provide the best available knowledge in any language in an interactive way, where we're not sitting to a lecture and writing down and taking notes and memorizing what's in a textbook, where we can converse with the knowledge that humanity has, think for ourselves, come out of the box and the silos and study the interrelationships between things. So I'm optimistic. The threats are there. I've been invited to join a council that's working on how do you govern this thing before it takes over. But at the same time, I think the opportunities are tremendous, and we just have to learn how to use that positively.
One last question. Would you have an advice to give to a young person that might listen to this conversation?
I guess from my own experience, the most wonderful thing I ever did, and I never thought I would do it, I never intended to do it, or anything, was to reach out beyond my upbringing and all that I thought and believed was the truth and reality, and explore other points of view. And it's been such an enriching experience for me. I would encourage us, I would encourage anybody, especially the young, that we have so far to go and there's so much more we need to discover. And I believe we can. And it's been known in the past, it's been lost, it's been discredited even by the people whose ancestors possessed it. I think there are great truths that are not being given the attention they deserve. And there's much to be learned from what is vaguely described as spirituality and spiritual experience. And that means a lot of things, and it goes in a lot of directions, and I'm not endorsing anything. It's got its own, but I think I believe the reality is much greater than what the sum total of scientific knowledge in the world advocates or supports or validates. And the rest of it is really important for us. And I look to a time in the future. What I was going to say is when these parts are reconciled with each other. A very famous thought that I learned when I went to India is that contradictions are complements. What the mind sees as opposites, as incompatible, unreconcilable contradictions, are really complementary parts of a greater whole. And I think that's true of science and spirituality. I'm not saying we should all drop our science and go off to the Himalayas or anything like that. I think there are truths on both sides, and if we can find out how to reconcile them, that we'll be taking a really important step towards the future, towards our own humanity. And it's not to reject the world, for sure. It's not to reject other experience. It's to really find out the meaning for ourselves. And that's what each of us has to do. You know, there's no book that can, but experience. What we need is an experience. It's not a question of beliefs. Beliefs can help us on the way. We can have faith in something, but to not settle it until we get the experience and find out for ourselves what's really real. And I have a lot of hope for the young. Ours was a rebellious generation. We didn't know what we were rebelling. We were rebelling against everything because everything our parents had achieved didn't seem to be fulfilling. It was very prosperous. I was raised in a prosperous family. I was raised in a prosperous country at a time when the U.S. was growing and all. But I didn't see that that was the secret of life. I didn't see that we were getting our inner fulfillment. There must be something more to life than just material development or even scientific discovery. So I think we need to keep searching for it. A lot of people are searching in different ways. And that's the healthiest, that's the best sign to me.